My father called it my war game obsession and rolled his eyes every time I mentioned tactical strategies or battlefield analysis. He thought I was just another kid lost in fantasy, playing too many video games and watching too many documentaries. But when Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's entire reconnaissance unit was about to walk into what I recognized as a textbook ambush formation in the mountains of Afghanistan, my so-called obsession became the difference between 37 soldiers coming home alive in 37 flag-draped coffins. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The argument started when I was 14. Every family dinner became a battlefield of its own, with Dad shaking his head as I explained why the Germans lost at Stalingrad, or how the terrain at Gettysburg determined the outcome before the first shot was fired. Mom would try to change the subject, but I couldn't help myself. Military history wasn't just interesting to me, it was everything. "Marcus, you need to focus on real life," Dad would say, cutting into his steak with unnecessary force. This war stuff isn't going to pay the bills or get you a decent job. You're 17 now, time to grow up." But David Chen, my older brother, understood. He'd come back from his first deployment in Iraq with stories that made my textbook knowledge feel inadequate and thrilling at the same time. While Dad dismissed my passion as childish fantasy, David would sit with me for hours, comparing what I'd learned from studying historical battles with what he'd experienced in actual combat zones. The kids got a point about flanking maneuvers. David told Dad one evening after I'd spent 20 minutes explaining why the British failed at Gallipoli. "Some of the stuff he's saying makes sense from what I've seen over there." Dad just grunted and turned up the volume on the television. My obsession wasn't limited to ancient battles. I devoured everything: modern warfare tactics, guerrilla strategies, terrain analysis, supply chain logistics, communication protocols. I read declassified military documents until my eyes burned, watched training videos that most civilians never see, and memorized the specifications of weapons systems that wouldn't be used for another decade. The basement became my command center. Wall-mounted maps covered every surface, marked with colored pins showing troop movements from famous battles. I had detailed scale models of famous battlefields: Normandy, Midway, the Battle of the Bulge. But more importantly, I had modern topographical maps of current conflict zones, marked with potential strategic positions and weak points that I'd identified through careful analysis. My friends thought it was weird. Girls definitely thought it was weird. But I couldn't stop. There was something about understanding how battles were won and lost, how terrain and timing and intelligence could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe, that consumed every free moment I had. Senior year of high school, my social studies teacher, Mrs. Patterson, encouraged me to enter a national competition for young military strategists. The challenge was to analyze a hypothetical combat scenario in mountainous terrain and propose a tactical response. I spent 3 weeks on my submission, creating detailed battle plans, contingency strategies, and risk assessments for a fictional reconnaissance mission in hostile territory. I won first place. The prize was a trip to Fort Bragg, where I got to meet actual military strategists and observe training exercises. For 1 week, I wasn't just reading about military tactics. I was watching them in action, asking questions that made seasoned officers pause and think, contributing ideas that earned respectful nods instead of eye rolls. Colonel James Richardson, the base's head of tactical operations, pulled me aside on the last day. "Son, you've got an instinct for this that most officers take years to develop. Have you considered West Point?" I had, but Dad had made it clear that military service wasn't an option he'd support. "Focus on business or engineering," he'd said. Something practical. When I got home and told my parents about Colonel Richardson's suggestion, Dad's response was predictable. "You're not throwing your life away on some military fantasy, Marcus. You've got good grades. You can get into a decent college and study something that matters." "This does matter," I said, probably too loudly. "People's lives depend on getting this stuff right." People's lives depend on doctors and lawyers and business leaders, Dad shot back. Not on kids who think war is some kind of game. That was the end of the conversation. Dad made it clear that if I wanted his support for college, it would be for something practical. Military strategy wasn't practical. My knowledge was just an expensive hobby that needed to end. So I enrolled at State University as a business major, but I never stopped studying military tactics. In my dorm room, late at night, I continued analyzing battle scenarios, following current conflicts, and developing theoretical strategies for situations that might never occur. My roommate, Tommy Valdez, was majoring in computer science and thought my late-night map sessions were hilarious. "Dude, you're like a general without an army," he'd say, watching me work through complex tactical problems on my laptop. "What are you gonna do with all this stuff?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that somewhere, real soldiers were facing real dangers, and the strategies I understood could make a difference. But Dad was right about one thing. There was no clear path from my basement war room to actually helping anyone. That changed during spring break of my sophomore year. David had been deployed again, this time to Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne. His letters home were different this time, more serious, more worried. He wasn't talking about routine patrols anymore. His unit was conducting reconnaissance operations in Taliban-controlled territory, gathering intelligence on enemy positions and supply routes. "The terrain out here is brutal," he wrote in one letter. "Mountains everywhere, perfect for ambushes. Command keeps sending us into valleys that make me nervous, but they know what they're doing." But when David described the specific locations his unit was operating in, something clicked. I'd studied that region extensively, analyzed dozens of historical battles fought in similar terrain. The tactical patterns David described in his letters weren't just making me nervous, they were setting off every alarm in my military strategy knowledge base. I spread out detailed topographical maps of the region on my dorm room floor, marking the positions David had mentioned. The pattern was unmistakable. His unit was being funneled into terrain that offered perfect ambush opportunities for enemy forces. The valleys they were patrolling, the ridgelines they were using for observation posts, the supply routes they were following, everything was textbook vulnerable. "Tommy, look at this," I said, showing him the maps. "These positions are death traps." Tommy squinted at the complex markings I'd made on the maps. "How can you tell?" "Because it's exactly what happened at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, and at Isandlwana in 1879, and at Kasserine Pass in 1943. When you funnel your forces through narrow terrain like this, you're giving the enemy every advantage. High ground, concealment, multiple escape routes, limited options for the attacking force. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The more I studied David's patrol routes, the more convinced I became that his unit was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. But what could I do? I was a 19-year-old college student with no military rank, no official connections, and a father who thought my knowledge was worthless fantasy. Still, I had to try something. These weren't just theoretical battle scenarios anymore. This was my brother's life. I spent the next 72 hours barely sleeping, cross-referencing intelligence reports I could access through military history databases with the patrol schedules David had mentioned in his letters. The picture that emerged made my stomach turn. Every tactical indicator pointed to an imminent large-scale ambush, perfectly timed to coincide with his unit's next reconnaissance mission. The problem was credibility. Who was going to listen to a college sophomore with no military experience? I couldn't just call the Pentagon and explain that my dorm room analysis suggested an entire battalion was in danger. But I had to find someone, anyone, who would take me seriously. Professor Angela Martinez taught military history at the university and had served as an intelligence analyst before her academic career. She'd always been supportive of my unconventional, approach to studying warfare, so I decided to take my evidence to her. Her office was cramped with books and papers, maps covering one entire wall. When I spread out my analysis across her desk, showing her the patrol routes, enemy movement patterns, and historical precedents, she studied everything with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years evaluating battlefield intelligence. "Marcus, this is remarkably thorough work," she said after 20 minutes of silent examination. "Your analysis of the terrain vulnerabilities is spot on, and these historical parallels are genuinely troubling. But getting this information to the right people in the military hierarchy, that's not going to be easy." She made some phone calls while I waited, speaking in hushed tones with contacts from her intelligence days. Finally, she hung up and turned, back to me with a mixture of hope and skepticism. I reached out to Captain Sarah Williams at the Joint Operations Center. "She's willing to look at your analysis, but she was very clear that unofficial tactical assessments from civilians don't usually carry much weight in active operations planning." Captain Williams agreed to meet with me the following day at a military installation 2 hours from campus. Professor Martinez drove me there, and during the entire trip, I rehearsed how to present my findings without sounding like a war-obsessed kid playing with maps. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room with fluorescent lighting that made everything feel urgent and clinical. Captain Williams was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with sharp eyes that evaluated everything I said with professional skepticism. "Show me what you've got," she said simply. I laid out the topographical maps, pointing to the specific valleys and ridgelines where David's unit was operating. Using colored markers, I traced the patrol patterns I'd identified from his letters, then overlaid them with optimal ambush positions based on historical tactical analysis. "Here's the problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "These patrol routes create a predictable pattern that funnels reconnaissance teams through terrain that offers no tactical advantages. Look at these elevation maps. Every approach is dominated by higher ground that provides perfect concealment for enemy forces." Captain Williams studied the maps, occasionally asking technical questions about sightlines, escape routes, and communication dead zones. Her questions were specific and informed, testing whether my analysis was based on genuine tactical understanding or just theoretical knowledge. "You mentioned historical precedents," she said. "Walk me through those." I explained how similar terrain had been used throughout military history to devastating effect. The narrow passes where Roman legions were slaughtered, the valleys where British forces were ambushed during colonial conflicts, the mountains where modern guerrilla forces had repeatedly outmaneuvered conventional armies. "The tactical principles haven't changed," I said. "When you force your reconnaissance units to operate in terrain that limits their mobility and communication options while providing excellent concealment for enemy forces, you're essentially recreating the same conditions that led to disasters throughout military history." Captain Williams was quiet for a long time, studying the maps and cross-referencing them with information on her laptop that I couldn't see. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Your brother is with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you developed this analysis purely from information in personal letters? No classified sources? No inside intelligence?" "Everything came from publicly available topographical data, historical battle records, and details David mentioned about their operating areas. I know it's not official intelligence, but the patterns are unmistakable." She nodded slowly, then made a phone call that lasted 15 minutes. I could only hear her side of the conversation, but phrases like credible tactical assessment and immediate evaluation required suggested she was taking my analysis seriously. When she hung up, Captain Williams gathered up all my maps and documentation. "I'm forwarding your analysis to the Operational Planning Committee overseeing Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's reconnaissance missions. They'll evaluate your findings against current intelligence and determine whether operational adjustments are warranted." "Does that mean they'll change the patrol routes?" I asked. It means they'll take your assessment seriously. That's all I can promise. The drive back to campus felt endless. Professor Martinez tried to reassure me that I'd done everything possible, but uncertainty gnawed at me. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, and David's unit was scheduled for another major reconnaissance operation within the week. 2 days later, I received a call that changed everything. "Is this Marcus Chen?" "Yes, sir. This is Major Robert Hayes from Strategic Operations Command. I understand you provided tactical analysis regarding current operations in Afghanistan." My heart started pounding. "Yes, sir, I did. Son, I need you to walk me through every detail of your assessment. We've received intelligence that corroborates several elements of your analysis, and we need to understand exactly how you identified these vulnerabilities." For the next hour, Major Hayes grilled me on every aspect of my tactical evaluation. He asked about specific elevation measurements, optimal firing positions, communication dead zones, and escape route analysis. His questions were more detailed and technically sophisticated than anything I'd faced before, clearly designed to determine whether my conclusions were based on genuine tactical expertise or lucky guesswork. "Your analysis identifies 3 potential ambush positions that align perfectly with recent enemy activity reports," he said finally. "How did you determine these specific locations?" I explained my methodology, how historical battle analysis had taught me to identify terrain features that provided tactical advantages, how I'd applied those principles to the topographical maps of David's operating area, and how the enemy movement patterns suggested coordinated positioning for a large-scale ambush. "We're implementing immediate operational changes based on your assessment," Major Hayes said. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's unit will be conducting their next reconnaissance mission using alternative routes and enhanced tactical protocols." Relief flooded through me, but it was mixed with new anxiety. If my analysis was wrong, I might have just disrupted critical military operations based on nothing more than theoretical knowledge and educated guessing. "Sir, what if I'm mistaken? What if changing their plans based on my assessment causes problems?" Major Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Son, in military operations, we evaluate intelligence from multiple sources and make decisions based on the best information available. Your analysis identified tactical vulnerabilities that our field commanders hadn't fully considered. Whether or not there's an immediate threat, those vulnerabilities need to be addressed." 3 days later, I got a text message from David that made my hands shake as I read it. "Route changes saved our lives. We'll explain when I get home. Thank you." The full story came 3 weeks later when David called me from Bagram Airfield during a brief communication window. His voice sounded different, older, more serious than I'd ever heard it. "Marcus, I need you to understand what actually happened out there." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison had been skeptical when orders came down to alter their planned reconnaissance route. The original mission was supposed to be a standard intelligence gathering operation in the Kunar province, following established patrol patterns that had been used successfully for months. Morrison wasn't happy about changing tactics based on what he called armchair analysis from a college kid, David explained. But Major General Patricia Coleman had reviewed your assessment personally and made it clear the route changes weren't optional. The new route took them through more challenging terrain, longer approach times, more difficult communication with base, and additional equipment requirements. Several experienced sergeants questioned the tactical wisdom of deviating from proven patrol strategies based on theoretical analysis. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez kept muttering about fighting wars with textbooks instead of experience, David said. "Honestly, I was starting to wonder if you'd gotten us into a more dangerous situation instead of keeping us safe." The altered reconnaissance mission launched at 0400 hours on a Tuesday morning. Instead of approaching through the valley systems I'd identified as vulnerable, Morrison's unit took a longer route through higher terrain that provided better observation points and multiple escape options. We were about 6 hours into the mission when Rodriguez spotted movement in the original valley we were supposed to patrol, David continued. At first, it looked like normal civilian activity, a few people moving around some buildings about 2 clicks away. But Rodriguez was a veteran with 3 deployments and instincts honed by years of combat experience. Something about the movement patterns bothered him enough to call for enhanced surveillance through their long-range optical equipment. What we saw through the scopes changed everything. The civilian activity was actually a coordinated positioning of at least 40 Taliban fighters complete with heavy weapons, improvised explosive devices, and sophisticated communication equipment. They had established overlapping fields of fire covering every approach route that Morrison's unit would have used under the original mission plan. Marcus, they weren't just ready for an ambush, they were ready for a massacre. RPGs positioned on the high ground, machine gun nests covering the valley floor, IEDs buried along every path we would have taken. They had been planning this for weeks. The Taliban had somehow obtained detailed information about American patrol patterns and had spent considerable time preparing a kill zone designed specifically to eliminate an entire reconnaissance unit. The ambush site was elaborate and professionally constructed, indicating coordination between multiple enemy cells. Rodriguez counted at least 12 different fighting positions, all camouflaged and positioned to create interlocking fire zones. If we had walked into that valley using our original route, none of us would have made it out. Morrison immediately called for air support and additional ground units to neutralize the threat. F-16 fighter jets arrived within 30 minutes, followed by Apache attack helicopters and a full company of infantry reinforcements. The airstrike was incredible to watch from our position. When those bombs hit the valley, secondary explosions kept going off for 10 minutes. They had stockpiled enough ammunition and explosives to supply a major offensive operation. The subsequent ground assault revealed the true scope of the planned ambush. Intelligence officers recovered detailed maps showing American patrol routes, photographs of Morrison's unit members, and communication equipment that had been used to coordinate the attack timing with other Taliban cells in the region. They knew our names, Marcus. They had pictures of individual soldiers, including me. This wasn't some random ambush. It was a targeted assassination operation designed to eliminate specific personnel. The intelligence value of disrupting the ambush extended far beyond saving Morrison's reconnaissance unit. The captured equipment and documents revealed a network of Taliban cells that had been planning coordinated attacks against multiple American positions throughout the province. Because we avoided the ambush instead of walking into it, we were able to capture intact intelligence that led to raids on 6 different enemy positions over the following week. Your analysis didn't just save our lives. It prevented what would have been the most successful Taliban operation in that region in over 2 years. Major Hayes called me the day after the airstrikes to provide an official debrief on how my analysis had contributed to the successful disruption of enemy operations. Son, your tactical assessment identified vulnerabilities that led to the prevention of significant American casualties and the disruption of a major enemy operation. The intelligence gathered from that site is already being used to protect other units throughout the theater. But the conversation that mattered most came when David returned home 6 months later. He walked into our house wearing his dress uniform, carrying official documentation that I couldn't have imagined when this whole situation started. Dad, I need you to see something. David spread out commendation letters on the dining room table, official recognition from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, Major General Coleman, and the Department of Defense acknowledging the contribution of tactical analysis that had prevented casualties and disrupted enemy operations. Marcus identified tactical vulnerabilities through historical battle analysis and terrain evaluation that our field commanders had missed, David read from Morrison's letter. His assessment directly resulted in operational changes that saved the lives of 37 American service members. Dad picked up each document, reading them carefully with an expression I'd never seen before. The dismissive skepticism was gone, replaced by something closer to amazement. I don't understand, Dad said finally. How did you know? For the first time in years, I had his complete attention. Not the frustrated tolerance he'd shown during family dinner arguments, but genuine interest in understanding how my military fantasy had translated into saving real lives. The tactical principles haven't changed in thousands of years, I explained. Armies that allow themselves to be funneled into terrain that favors their enemies get defeated, whether it's Romans fighting Germanic tribes or modern soldiers facing insurgent forces. The technology changes, but the underlying strategic realities remain the same. Dad was quiet for a long time, studying the commendation letters and looking at me with what might have been the beginning of respect. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "I thought you were wasting your time with all those books and maps and battle studies. I didn't understand that you were actually learning something that mattered." David smiled and pulled out one more document, an official invitation from the United States Military Academy at West Point, offering me admission with full academic scholarship based on demonstrated tactical aptitude and potential contribution to military service. "Colonel Richardson remembered you from that competition," David said. "When word got back to him about what happened in Afghanistan, he made some calls. If you want it, you have a spot at West Point starting next fall." The West Point acceptance letter sat on my desk for 2 weeks before I gave Colonel Richardson an answer. The opportunity was everything I'd dreamed about since I was 14, but something had shifted during those months of waiting to hear whether David would come home alive. "You're hesitating," Mom observed one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "A year ago, you would have said yes immediately." She was right. But seeing my theoretical knowledge translate into real consequences, lives saved, families that wouldn't receive devastating phone calls, soldiers who would return home intact, had changed how I understood the responsibility that came with tactical expertise. "It's not about hesitation," I told her. "It's about understanding what this actually means." The decision became clearer when Major Hayes called with an unexpected proposition. The Department of Defense was establishing a new civilian consultant program designed to incorporate unconventional analytical approaches into military planning. They wanted people who could think outside traditional military frameworks while understanding tactical realities. "We're looking for individuals who can identify vulnerabilities that career military officers might miss due to conventional thinking," Hayes explained. "Your Afghanistan analysis demonstrated exactly the kind of perspective we need. The program would allow me to finish my degree while working part-time on tactical assessments for various military operations. Instead of spending 4 years at West Point learning to become an officer, I could immediately begin contributing to real-world strategic planning. The position comes with security clearance, access to classified intelligence, and direct consultation with operational commanders," Hayes continued. "You'd be working on active missions, providing analysis that could affect current operations. But the most compelling aspect wasn't the professional opportunity. It was a conversation I had with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison when he visited our university as part of a lecture series on modern warfare. Morrison was different from what I'd expected. Younger than most lieutenant colonels, with an analytical intensity that reminded me of my best professors. When we talked after his presentation, he brought up the Afghanistan operation without any prompting. "Your assessment saved my soldiers, but more importantly, it taught me something about the limitations of conventional tactical thinking," he said. "We'd been using those patrol routes for months without recognizing their vulnerability because we were thinking like soldiers, not like strategists." He explained how the enemy had exploited predictable American tactical patterns, using the military's own operational consistency against them. Traditional military training emphasized proven techniques and standard operating procedures, but those same patterns could become weaknesses when facing adaptive enemies. "What you did was think like the enemy while understanding our capabilities," Morrison continued. "That combination of perspectives is exactly what we need more of in strategic planning. The civilian consultant position would let me work directly with commanders like Morrison, providing analytical support for operations worldwide while maintaining the outsider perspective that had made my Afghanistan assessment valuable. Called Colonel Richardson to decline the West Point appointment, then accepted the Defense Department position that same afternoon. The work turned out to be more challenging and more rewarding than I'd imagined. Within 6 months, I was analyzing potential vulnerabilities for operations in 7 different countries, working with intelligence officers to identify tactical patterns that enemy forces might exploit. My first major assignment involved assessing the security of forward operating bases in Syria. Using satellite imagery and historical analysis of similar installations, I identified defensive weaknesses that had gone unnoticed during the initial construction planning. Your recommendations resulted in architectural modifications that prevented what intelligence suggests would have been successful rocket attacks on 3 different bases. My supervisor, Dr. Lisa Thompson, told me during my first performance review. But the assignment that truly validated my unconventional approach came 8 months into the program. Naval intelligence was concerned about potential threats to shipping lanes in the South China Sea, where increasing Chinese military presence was creating new strategic challenges. Using maritime battle analysis from World War II combined with modern surveillance data, I identified patrol patterns that were creating predictable vulnerabilities for American naval operations. The recommendations I developed led to tactical adjustments that significantly improved security for merchant shipping and military vessels operating in the region. Your analysis prevented what could have been the first major naval incident between American and Chinese forces in decades, Admiral Catherine Foster told me during a briefing at the Pentagon. The pattern recognition skills you've developed are exactly what we need to anticipate potential conflicts before they escalate. The work was classified, demanding, and occasionally terrifying when I realized how many lives depended on getting the analysis right. But it was also exactly what I'd been preparing for during all those years of studying battles, memorizing tactical principles, and developing strategic thinking skills. Dad's transformation was the most surprising aspect of the entire experience. The man who'd spent years dismissing my interests as impractical fantasies became my strongest supporter, asking detailed questions about my work and proudly telling his friends about his son's contributions to national security. I was wrong about everything, he admitted one evening as we watched the news together. I thought practical meant safe and predictable. I didn't understand that your kind of thinking was exactly what the world actually needs. David completed 2 more deployments, using tactical insights I'd developed to help his units avoid the kinds of vulnerabilities that had nearly cost them their lives in Afghanistan. Our relationship changed from protective older brother and admiring younger sibling to professional colleagues comparing notes on strategic challenges. You found your calling, he told me after returning from his final deployment. But more than that, you found a way to make knowledge matter in the real world. The civilian consultant program expanded rapidly, recruiting analysts with unconventional backgrounds to provide strategic perspectives that complemented traditional military planning. Within 2 years, I was supervising a team of 12 researchers, each specializing in different aspects of tactical analysis and threat assessment. My basement command center, once dismissed as an expensive hobby, became the foundation for strategic thinking that influenced military operations worldwide. The maps, battle studies, and tactical analyses that Dad had considered worthless fantasies were now informing decisions that affected global security. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came during a video call with a Marine captain, stationed in Somalia. Captain Jennifer Walsh had requested analytical support for convoy operations in hostile territory, and my team had developed route modifications based on historical ambush patterns. Your recommendations just helped 38 Marines complete their mission without a single casualty, she reported. The alternative routes you suggested avoided what we later discovered were multiple IED placements along our original path. 38 more families wouldn't receive devastating phone calls. 38 more service members would return home, safely because historical battle analysis had identified modern tactical vulnerabilities. That night, I called Dad to tell him about Captain Walsh's report. "I understand now," he said. "Your military fantasy wasn't a fantasy at all. It was preparation for exactly this kind of responsibility. Sometimes the skills that seem impractical turn out to be exactly what the world needs most. The difference between fantasy and expertise isn't the subject matter. It's the depth of understanding and the willingness to apply knowledge when lives depend on getting it right." 3 years into the consultant program, I encountered a challenge that made everything I'd done before seem straightforward by comparison. Dr. Thompson called me into her office on a Tuesday morning with an expression that immediately put me on alert. "We've got a situation developing that requires your specific expertise," she said, sliding a classified folder across her desk. "This one's different, Marcus. We're not just looking at tactical vulnerabilities. We're looking at the potential for a coordinated international incident." The briefing materials revealed intelligence suggesting that terrorist cells in 3 different countries were planning synchronized attacks against American diplomatic facilities. The attacks weren't connected through traditional command structures, but through shared tactical methodologies that suggested common training and planning. Intelligence agencies in Pakistan, Yemen, and the Philippines have detected unusual activity around our embassies, Dr. Thompson explained. Each situation looks different on the surface, but there are pattern similarities that have analysts worried. The challenge was unlike anything I'd faced before. Instead of analyzing terrain vulnerabilities or patrol route weaknesses, I needed to identify strategic connections between apparently unrelated security threats in completely different geographical and political contexts. I spent the next 48 hours immersed in intelligence reports, satellite imagery, and historical data on embassy security incidents. The patterns that emerged were subtle but unmistakable. Each potential attack site showed preparations that followed identical tactical principles, despite being planned by supposedly independent groups. "They're using the same playbook," I told Dr. Thompson during our emergency briefing. "Different locations, different personnel, different local conditions, but identical strategic approaches to neutralizing embassy security measures." The tactical analysis revealed that someone with sophisticated military training had developed a standardized methodology for attacking diplomatic facilities, then distributed that methodology to terrorist cells worldwide. The attacks were designed to occur simultaneously, creating maximum psychological impact and straining American response capabilities. If these attacks succeed, we're looking at potential casualties in the hundreds, Dr. Thompson said grimly, and the political ramifications could destabilize relationships with allied governments in all 3 regions. But identifying the pattern was only the first step. Preventing coordinated international attacks required coordination between multiple intelligence agencies, diplomatic security services, and local military forces, all operating under different protocols and command structures. The State Department convened an emergency task force that included representatives from the CIA, FBI, Defense Intelligence Agency, and diplomatic security personnel from each threatened location. My role was to provide tactical analysis that could inform security modifications at all 3 embassies simultaneously. "The key vulnerability is timing," I explained during the classified briefing. "Each attack is designed to exploit specific security procedures that occur during shift changes and routine operations. But if we modify those procedures in coordinated ways, we can turn their synchronized planning into a disadvantage." The recommended security modifications were complex and had to be implemented without alerting potential attackers to our awareness of their plans. Enhanced surveillance, altered guard rotations, modified entry procedures, and repositioned defensive equipment, all coordinated across 3 continents. Ambassador Rebecca Martinez, who was overseeing security at the Pakistan embassy, participated in our planning sessions via encrypted video link. Her experience with diplomatic security gave her insights that complemented my tactical analysis. "The modifications you're suggesting will significantly impact our daily operations," she pointed out. We need to ensure that increased security measures don't interfere with legitimate diplomatic functions. This was the challenge that traditional, military tactical analysis couldn't address, balancing security requirements with diplomatic necessities. Embassies couldn't be turned into fortresses without damaging their ability to conduct international relations. Working with Ambassador Martinez and her counterparts in Yemen and the Philippines, we developed security protocols that appeared to maintain normal diplomatic operations while actually implementing sophisticated defensive measures. The implementation phase was the most stressful 3 weeks of my career. Daily encrypted briefings tracked the progress of security modifications while monitoring intelligence reports for signs that terrorist cells had detected our preparations. Pakistani intelligence reports increased surveillance of our facility, Ambassador Martinez reported during one particularly tense briefing. They may be aware that we've altered our security posture, but the modifications were working exactly as planned. Instead of providing attackers with predictable security patterns to exploit, the embassies were now operating with defensive protocols that would neutralize the tactical advantages the coordinated attacks were designed to exploit. The crisis came to a head on a Thursday morning when surveillance detected simultaneous movement by terrorist cells toward all 3 embassy locations. The attacks were beginning exactly as our analysis had predicted, but the security modifications we'd implemented meant the embassies were ready. All 3 facilities are reporting contact with hostile forces, Dr. Thompson told me over a secure phone line. Your tactical predictions were accurate to within 30 minutes of the actual attack timing. At the Pakistan embassy, Ambassador Martinez's security team used modified defensive positions to repel attackers who had expected to find standard security arrangements. The terrorists' carefully planned assault routes led them into prepared killing zones instead of vulnerable entry points. The attackers seemed confused by our security posture, Ambassador Martinez reported after the incident. Their tactical approach suggested they had detailed intelligence about our previous procedures, but the modifications we implemented left them exposed and disoriented. Similar results occurred at the Yemen and Philippines locations. The coordinated nature of the attacks, which would have been their greatest strength under normal circumstances, became a weakness when all 3 embassies were prepared with modified security protocols. Final casualty report: 0 American diplomatic personnel killed or seriously wounded across all 3 incidents, Dr. Thompson announced during our post-incident debriefing. Local security forces neutralized all attacking elements with minimal friendly casualties. The intelligence value of successfully repelling coordinated attacks while capturing attackers alive proved even more significant than preventing the immediate casualties. Interrogation of captured terrorists revealed the existence of a sophisticated training network that had been preparing similar attacks against American facilities worldwide. Your pattern analysis didn't just prevent 3 embassy attacks, CIA Director Michael Foster told me during a classified briefing at Langley. It exposed an international terrorist training operation that we've now been able to disrupt in 7 different countries. The network had been operating for over 2 years, recruiting local terrorist cells and training them to attack diplomatic facilities using standardized tactical methodologies. By identifying the common patterns in their attack planning, we'd been able to expose and neutralize the entire operation. But the professional recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source. David, now a major with his own tactical analysis responsibilities, called me after the embassy incident details were declassified enough for him to understand what had happened. Marcus, what you did with those embassy attacks, that wasn't just tactical analysis. That was strategic thinking at a level that most career officers never achieve. You found a way to see patterns that others miss because you think about warfare differently than people who learned it through traditional military training. The embassy incident established my reputation within the intelligence community as someone who could identify strategic vulnerabilities that conventional analysis might miss. Over the following months, I received requests for tactical assessments from agencies I'd never worked with before. "We'd like you to analyze potential security vulnerabilities for the upcoming G7 summit," Secret Service Director Patricia Hayes told me during a briefing that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. "Your pattern recognition capabilities could help us identify threats that traditional security planning might overlook." The G7 summit assignment introduced me to a completely different category of security challenge. Unlike military operations or embassy defense, protecting world leaders requires anticipating threats that could come from any direction: foreign intelligence services, domestic terrorists, lone wolf attackers, or even sophisticated criminals seeking maximum publicity impact. Secret Service Director Hayes assembled a task force that included representatives from the security services of all 7 participating nations. My role was to analyze potential vulnerabilities in the summit's security architecture that might not be obvious to traditional protective service planning. Each participating country has different threat assessment methodologies, Director Hayes explained during our initial briefing. "What we need is someone who can identify security gaps that might emerge from the interaction between different protective approaches." The summit was scheduled to take place at a resort in Montana, chosen specifically for its isolated location and controlled access points. But isolation that provided security advantages could also create vulnerabilities if attackers found ways to exploit the limited escape routes and communication options. I spent 2 weeks at the resort, analyzing every aspect of the security setup from the perspective of someone planning an attack. The exercise was intellectually challenging and ethically disturbing, thinking like a terrorist while working to protect the most important political leaders in the world. The main vulnerability is the assumption that isolation equals security, I reported to the task force. While the limited access points make it easier to control who gets near the summit, they also create predictable patterns that sophisticated attackers could exploit. My analysis identified 3 specific scenarios where the resort's isolation could be turned into an advantage for potential attackers. Most concerning was the possibility of coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm the security perimeter while cutting off reinforcement and evacuation routes. If attackers simultaneously target the access roads, communication infrastructure, and air support capabilities, they could temporarily isolate the summit site and create a window of vulnerability that traditional security planning might not adequately address, I explained. The multinational security team was initially skeptical of recommendations from someone without protective service experience. Agent Catherine Ross, who headed the British security detail, made her concerns clear during one particularly tense planning session. "With respect, Mr. Chen, protecting world leaders isn't the same as analyzing military tactical situations. The threat assessment methodologies are fundamentally different, and the consequences of miscalculation are unprecedented." She was absolutely right about the stakes, but wrong about the analytical approach. The same pattern recognition skills that had worked for military operations and embassy security could be applied to protective service challenges, just with different variables and constraints. "Agent Ross, the tactical principles remain the same," I responded. "Attackers will try to exploit predictable security patterns and create advantages through timing, positioning, and coordination. The specific context changes, but the underlying strategic realities don't." To prove the point, I walked the security team through a detailed analysis of how the resort's defensive setup compared to historical examples of successful and unsuccessful attacks on fortified positions. The parallels were unmistakable once you understood what to look for. Director Hayes made the decision to implement modified security protocols based on my recommendations, despite objections from some team members who preferred conventional protective service approaches. "We're not abandoning traditional security measures," she clarified. "We're enhancing them with additional defensive layers designed to address vulnerabilities that conventional planning might not anticipate." The modifications included repositioned sniper teams, altered patrol routes, enhanced communication redundancy, and contingency evacuation procedures that didn't rely solely on the main access routes. Most importantly, We established coordination protocols between different national security teams to prevent gaps in coverage. The summit proceeded without incident, but 2 months later, we learned how close the enhanced security measures had come to preventing a catastrophe. NSA surveillance intercepted communications suggesting that a cell with connections to international terrorism had conducted detailed reconnaissance of the summit site. The intelligence indicates they abandoned their operation after observing security modifications that didn't match their advance planning, NSA Deputy Director James Mitchell told me during a classified debriefing. Your tactical adjustments may have prevented what would have been the most significant attack on international leadership in modern history. The successful G7 security operation led to requests for similar analysis from agencies I'd never imagined working with. The Department of Homeland Security wanted tactical assessments for major sporting events. The U.S. Marshals Service needed strategic analysis for high-profile court proceedings. Even the Federal Reserve requested security evaluations for financial infrastructure. Each assignment required adapting tactical thinking to completely different contexts and threat environments. Protecting the Super Bowl involved different considerations than securing a presidential inauguration, which was different from analyzing vulnerabilities at nuclear facilities. You've developed an approach to security analysis that transcends specific domains, Dr. Thompson observed during my annual performance review. The pattern recognition skills you started with have evolved into a comprehensive methodology for identifying systemic vulnerabilities. But the assignment that would prove most personally significant came from an unexpected source. The International Red Cross contacted the Defense Department requesting tactical analysis for humanitarian operations in conflict zones. Dr. Sarah Kumar, the Red Cross Regional Director for Africa, explained the challenge during a video conference. That changed my perspective on how tactical expertise could be applied beyond military and security contexts. Our medical teams are operating in areas where traditional combatants, criminal organizations, and local militias create overlapping security threats, she said. We need someone who can help us understand tactical patterns that might affect the safety of humanitarian personnel. The Red Cross assignment took me to Chad, where medical teams were providing emergency care in regions affected by ongoing conflicts. Unlike military operations with clear objectives and defined enemies, humanitarian work required navigating complex political situations where potential threats could come from any direction. The challenge isn't just identifying security vulnerabilities, Dr. Kumar explained as we toured medical facilities near the Chad-Sudan border. It's developing security protocols that don't interfere with our ability to provide medical care to everyone who needs it, regardless of their political affiliations. Working with Red Cross security personnel, I analyzed attack patterns that had targeted humanitarian operations throughout the region. The tactical approaches varied significantly, depending on who was conducting the attacks and what their objectives were. Military forces attack humanitarian facilities to deny medical care to their enemies, I explained during a briefing with Red Cross field coordinators. Criminal organizations attack them for supplies and equipment. Local militias attack them to control access to medical services. Each type of threat requires different defensive considerations. The security protocols we developed for Red Cross operations had to address multiple threat categories while maintaining the political neutrality that allowed humanitarian organizations to operate in conflict zones. It was the most complex tactical challenge I'd ever faced. Your analysis helped us modify our operational procedures in ways that significantly improved security without compromising our medical mission, Dr. Kumar told me after 6 months of implementation. More importantly, you helped us understand that tactical thinking could serve humanitarian objectives rather than just military ones. The Red Cross assignment opened up an entirely new application for the analytical skills that had started with studying historical battles in my basement. Tactical expertise could protect people who were trying to save lives rather than just those who were trying to take them. Working in Chad also reconnected me with the human cost of the strategic decisions I'd been analyzing from comfortable offices in Washington. Every security protocol I developed had direct consequences for doctors, nurses, and aid workers who were risking their lives to help others in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. This is what tactical knowledge should really be used for, I wrote to David during my deployment to Chad. Not just preventing casualties among soldiers, but protecting people who are trying to heal the damage that conflicts create. 5 years after that first phone call from Major Hayes, I found myself standing in the Oval Office, briefing the President of the United States on strategic vulnerabilities that could affect national security for the next decade. The journey, from Dad's dismissive dinner table comments to advising the highest levels of government, felt surreal. But the work had become more crucial than I'd ever imagined. Marcus, your analysis of emerging threat patterns has been instrumental in shaping our defensive strategies, President Johnson said during the briefing. The pattern recognition capabilities you've developed are exactly what we need to stay ahead of adversaries who are constantly adapting their tactical approaches. The briefing focused on a comprehensive threat assessment I'd developed over 18 months, analyzing how terrorist organizations, hostile nation-states, and criminal enterprises were evolving their strategies to exploit weaknesses in American security infrastructure. The patterns I'd identified suggested coordinated efforts to test defensive responses across multiple domains simultaneously. The most concerning development is the integration of cyber warfare tactics with traditional physical attacks, I explained to the President and his national security team. Adversaries are learning to combine digital infrastructure attacks with kinetic operations in ways that amplify the effectiveness of both approaches. This evolution required completely new analytical frameworks that combined traditional military, tactical analysis with cybersecurity threat assessment, economic warfare considerations, and information operations impact evaluation. The complexity was staggering, but the fundamental pattern recognition principles remained consistent. Secretary of Defense Patricia Coleman, who had been following my work since the Afghanistan analysis, asked the question that had been driving policy discussions for months. Based on your assessment, what are the most critical vulnerabilities we need to address to maintain strategic advantages over the next 5 years? The answer required synthesizing everything I'd learned from military operations, embassy security, diplomatic protection, and humanitarian mission analysis into a comprehensive strategic recommendation for national defense policy. The primary vulnerability is our reliance on predictable response patterns, I replied. Whether we're talking about military deployments, diplomatic security, emergency services, or critical infrastructure protection, American defensive strategies have become systematized in ways that sophisticated adversaries can exploit. The recommendation I presented was both simple and revolutionary. Develop adaptive defensive protocols that could be modified in real time based on emerging threat intelligence, rather than relying on standardized procedures that adversaries could study and counter. We need defensive systems that can evolve faster than our enemies can adapt to them, I continued. That requires building unpredictability into our strategic planning while maintaining operational effectiveness. Implementation of adaptive defense. Protocols became my primary focus for the following 2 years. Working with every major security agency, I helped develop tactical frameworks that could be rapidly modified based on emerging intelligence without compromising operational capabilities. The first major test came when intelligence detected preparations for coordinated attacks against American interests in 12 different countries. Unlike previous threats that followed predictable patterns, these attacks were designed to exploit standard American response protocols by creating more threats than traditional security measures could address simultaneously. They're trying to overwhelm our defensive capabilities by forcing us to respond to more situations than we can effectively handle, I explained to the crisis response team. But if we use adaptive protocols instead of standard procedures, we can turn their coordination into a vulnerability. The response we implemented abandoned conventional threat prioritization in favor of dynamic resource allocation based on real-time tactical assessment. Instead of following predetermined security protocols, American facilities worldwide implemented defensive measures tailored to the specific threats they faced. The results exceeded every expectation. Not only were all 12 potential attacks prevented, but the adaptive response protocols allowed American forces to capture intelligence that exposed terrorist training networks in 7 additional countries that hadn't been previously identified. Your adaptive defense concept didn't just prevent attacks, CIA Director Foster told me during the post-operation briefing. It gave us intelligence advantages that we're still exploiting 6 months later. But the validation that meant most to me came from an unexpected source. David, now a colonel with strategic planning responsibilities, called me after reviewing classified reports on the adaptive defense operations. Marcus, what you've accomplished goes beyond tactical analysis. You've fundamentally changed how American defense strategy adapts to evolving threats. That kid who used to argue about military history at dinner has become one of the most important strategic thinkers in national security. The recognition from David meant more than any official commendation, because he understood both where I'd started and how far the work had evolved. From basement maps and historical battle studies to advising presidents and reshaping national defense policy, the journey had been longer and more complex than either of us could have imagined. The personal transformation was equally significant. The teenager who'd been dismissed for impractical interests had become someone whose analytical capabilities were considered essential for national security. But more importantly, I'd found ways to use tactical knowledge to protect people rather than just defeat enemies. Dad's evolution had been just as remarkable. The man who'd once called my military interests a waste of time now proudly explained to his friends that his son was working on classified projects that he couldn't discuss, but that were protecting American lives worldwide. I've learned more about strategic thinking from watching your career than I learned in 40 years of business, Dad told me during one of our regular conversations. You took something I thought was impractical and turned it into one of the most important skills our country needs. The work continued to evolve in directions I couldn't have anticipated. Universities began requesting guest lectures on adaptive strategic thinking. International allies wanted consultation on developing their own adaptive defense capabilities. Even private corporations sought tactical analysis for protecting critical infrastructure and business operations. You've created a new discipline, Dr. Thompson observed during one of our planning sessions. Adaptive tactical analysis that can be applied to any situation where pattern recognition and strategic thinking can provide defensive advantages. But perhaps the most meaningful development came when the Defense Department established a new training program based on the analytical methodologies I'd developed. Young analysts with diverse backgrounds, historians, mathematicians, computer, scientists, even literature majors, were being trained to apply pattern recognition skills to strategic challenges. We're training the next generation of strategic thinkers to see vulnerabilities and opportunities that traditional military education might miss, the program director, Colonel Sandra Torres, explained. Your unconventional background proved that the best tactical analysts might come from unexpected places. The basement command center that had started everything was long gone, replaced by sophisticated analysis facilities with classified computer systems and secure communications equipment. But the fundamental approach remained the same: studying patterns, understanding tactical principles, and applying strategic thinking to protect people from harm. Late one evening, working on threat assessments in my classified office, I received a message that brought everything full circle. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, now a general with strategic command responsibilities, had sent a note about recent operations in Afghanistan where adaptive tactical protocols had prevented casualties. Among American forces, the defensive modifications your analytical framework made possible just saved another 37 soldiers, his message read. Different units, different circumstances, same life-saving results. The work you started with my reconnaissance team is still protecting American lives every day. 37 more families wouldn't receive devastating phone calls. 37 more service members would return home safely because pattern recognition and strategic thinking had identified vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. That's when I understood the real significance of everything that had happened. The dismissive comments at family dinners, the late night studying historical battles, the complex analytical challenges, the classified briefings, the presidential consultations. All of it had been preparation for a simple but crucial mission: using knowledge to keep people safe. Sometimes what appears to be an impractical obsession is actually preparation for the most important work you'll ever do. The difference between expertise and fantasy isn't the subject matter. It's the willingness to apply knowledge when lives depend on getting it right, and the determination to keep learning when the stakes couldn't be higher. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.